Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jerad and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Reinsurance Podcast. Today actually a totally emergency episode. We didn't plan on doing an episode in our usual schedule, but the big one, the hurricane that we'd been waiting for in the hurricane season from hell, has arrived. So we are doing a special episode today all around what's currently going on in Florida.
With Hurricane Milton.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So
this is a new format. It's like a let's talk about the news as it happens format, which is very different than how we normally approach this podcast and things that we cover. But as we think about the sort of role big events play, especially events in the U.S., especially cat events in Florida, plays like industry-wide, coming off the back of Monte Carlo, in advance of Baden-Baden, like this is timed is to be like critical to what happens in the future of this industry. So we wanted to spend 45 minutes, an hour or so here unpacking like what is happening, what we can see, what we know will our thoughts on the impact it might have downstream. So we've got some notes available. We've got more sort of resources at our disposal to tuck into this, but where should we start?
yeah, I mean, maybe just a couple of caveats so people know where we're coming from as well. We don't normally do live ones. We're recording late evening in London the night before, well, the night of landfall, effectively. So, if you're listening to this on the day of, you might be able to find out more, but presumably it'll still be a little bit hazy. So we've done our best to bring together everything everyone seems to know moments before the hurricane comes into land. The other caveat to add, of course, is we are here to talk about this from a reinsurance angle, how it changes our industry. It's a natural catastrophe, so there's also a lot of horrible suffering and probably loss of life associated with this event. If you're listening to this and you're affected, if your families are affected, we're thinking of you. We hope that everyone gets through okay and there's not too much damage. Best of luck with you getting out of that and out the other side of that as well as you can do. But we will mostly be talking about this from a financial sector point of view. So that's the caveat there in terms of topic. But without further ado, I guess let's dive into what we know right now. What is this Hurricane Milton thing?
So Hurricane Milton, it seems like the reports currently are that it's now been downgraded to a Cat 4 instead of a Cat 5, which is predominantly based on a wind speed, amongst some other things. And it's not quite as broad in its sort of footprint, if you will, as Helene was a bit earlier in the year. But it seems, as current reports are showing, that it's going to go possibly directly through Tampa, possibly can shift a bit south. One of the things that I was reading as I sort of read a number of different pieces around this in the build up to this episode is it feels like the track this hurricane is on is more uncertain than most other ones. And I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a meteorologist. I don't know quite why, but they seem to have less confidence in where this will go than other similar storms. So there's something happening there. It also seems like the size of the storm is also variable. Like it was a 2 a couple days ago, then it went up to a 5, then down again, now back up. So it's undulating in a way that I'm unsure why it's doing that either. So again, people are probably more aware of like the drivers of that, but it's a storm that has a lot of uncertainty. This close to landfall has a lot more uncertainty than other major events have happened, but it is possibly going to be the big event that everyone's sort of been fearing. Should we start with like the size of loss that we're thinking of?
I mean, I'll expand maybe a little bit on some of the things you said there, but yeah, I think that'd be a good place to go into would be the sort of expected loss values. But it does depend very much, as you said, on those final factors as it comes into land effectively. A lot of commentary from people watching this with a broader, is this the new normal? Is this climate change kind of hat saying, okay, the reason we're getting storms accelerate through these stages and forming so fast is because of warmer sea temperatures, which makes sense. The warmer air can carry more water effectively. You're seeing a lot more activity faster as a result of that. The way that it's coming into Tampa at the moment, it seems that Tampa Bay is sort of potentially right in the middle of the storm track. That's seen as the most potentially devastating scenario in terms of cost, partly because there are parts of the bay that it could hit and sort of get stuck at and have to run up a much higher storm surge if that happens. If it does drift slightly further south, which we're still watching the final movements, that could greatly lessen the impact, because then the storm surge itself would probably be more towards Sarasota, or even better if there is a better. I mean, it's not great if it comes to you if you're south, but a lesser impact is expected the further south it goes, as long as it doesn't go so far south that it then becomes a repeat of Hurricane Ian, which would be very costly as well. But I think we're most likely scenario looking at this going into the Tampa area as the primary course. Yeah.
When we're looking at the sort of range of losses or expected losses, the scenarios, if it goes south, turns south towards Sarasota, the sort of industry assumption is it's 20 to 30 billion. If it sort of lands between Tampa and Sarasota, probably 40 to 60. But if it sort of hits Tampa like directly, as still is a high likelihood, it's looking like 100 billion plus. Yeah. Like that's a mega event. That's like an industry shifting event. The thing that they point out in some of the reporting here is at 100 billion, like the whole value chain has issues, right? The retro and cat bond markets are blown up. The hurricane fund is exhausted by almost one order of two. So it becomes like a fundamentally like industry shifting one. If it shifts south enough and it's sort of 20 to 30, the consensus seems to be that the industry can absorb that. So it's very much like we're watching this, like, and it's a really hard one. I think our industry, we've talked about this in I think a number of other episodes, but these are the elements that make our industry really nuanced and complicated. So we're talking about like a very much an event that has a huge like danger to human life, but also like the impact this industry will play and the losses that it will absorb. Like, will this bankrupt insurance companies in the state, and what happens with that? Like so all that is, as you sort of pointed out in the intro, like on top of the astronomical danger to human life that sits behind this. So it's tough to wrestle with these two things together.
And I think it's worth maybe tucking into that value chain a bit, because it goes right the way down to, homeowners and businesses on the ground who have been trying to buy insurance. If you go back to, Ian, that's happened in 2022, so relatively recently, Michael back in 2018, that there've been quite a number of hits to the Florida region that have pushed up prices for everybody and made it, much more difficult for those insurance companies to get the reinsurance coverage that they need to protect them. Heavy reliance on state schemes again. And we're now watching this come in, what we probably thought of a decade ago as like a 1 in 50, depending on where it lands on that spectrum, like a 1 in possibly decades or many decades event, coming twice in 2 years, effectively. That raises a lot of challenges about what is going to be sustainable from a public and a private perspective. Not to mention the fact that we're going into an election, and people will be judged based on how they've signaled what they would do or would have done in different scenarios here. But looking at this as someone who might live in the state or work in the state, thinking about, am I going to be able to continue to live here? Will I be able to ensure my life or my prosperity or my assets, is a big question mark at the moment. Will the market support it?
Well, and it's not just, in a couple of years, if it follows enough of that Helene track, we're talking about once in a month, twice in a month. Right. It's tracking varies and those are the things when you think about the hit to the insurance companies. There's a bunch. If it follows a very close track to Helene, it's going to be hard to identify like which events things came into. So the reinsurance industry will struggle with that. Insurers might have to pay 2 or 3 reinstatements to their reinsurance book if it follows that same track. And maybe we should set aside a segment on its own for like the danger to human life piece. But like these events take months and months to clean up. And when you have another event following only a few weeks or a month later, like the amount of debris that's still out, that is now an absolute danger when it's being picked up at 200 miles an hour is horrifying. And so you're seeing the public efforts to like scramble to get tidied for something to just destroy it again is a very strange environment. I don't think, I mean, I've not followed the storms as long as maybe people in the industry have done, but like I cannot remember a time of a similar like tracking back-to-back kind of events like this, which is really unique and dangerous.
Yeah, I think it was just the 26th of September, I think, was the Helene event, and that, as you say, was so recent that there's question marks at this point as to how possible it's going to be, and definitely how easy it's going to be to distinguish between damage caused by Helene versus by this new one. Like, how do we know between Milton and Helene which one damaged a property that we've not been able to inspect because people stayed away, or boats and other assets that have been destroyed partially by one and then finished off by the other? Has cover been reinstated? Did they have cover for both events worth separately or just one event? There's going to be a lot of tidying, cleaning, and trying to just figure out what happened, which maybe makes us worry about, will we end up with some confusing claims to manage right the way through the change if we think about trapped capacity and things in previous years, working out how much should the industry be paying out.
Yeah. Well, and when we think about like hard and soft markets, one of the things that you always see in soft markets is a real growth in like coverage terms and things. And the same side on like when the market gets harder, like a constraint on or restriction on coverage terms. But it'll be interesting as well to see if this becomes something that's on the radar of reinsurers. Like this is a thing that can happen because it did. Like what will that look like in terms of wording around hours clauses and reinstatements? And so historically it's like you could get a couple, but they're quite spread out, or you get one singular event that's just very, very long. So the hours clause like cuts off somewhere. But this is a different thing. It feels reminiscent, and again in a very tragic way, to like the 9/11 event being a single or two separate events, and how the industry sort of wrestled with that at the time. It could have elements of that, to your point, of like it's so impossible to know which of these things was the driver of the loss that we're now paying out, and seeing how the industry reconciles with that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the soft and hard market there. I think one of the most interesting sort of industry considerations for us now is what's going to happen to the deals that are about to be placed, right? We're 10 days away from Baden-Baden kicking off, and some of those more tactical conversations when probably, firm order terms have started to appear or will be starting to appear. They might be going for a revision at this point, depending on what happens in the next 24 hours. If you think back to where we were post-Ian, it took a bit of a delay for the market to do the full turn that it did. The impact had to make it all the way through to retro for people to decide, actually, on balance, we're not playing again this year, and for the panic that sort of caused. Will it take as long this year for people to change their appetite, to think about whether they still want to play? You've already seen, I think we saw something interesting in the news probably only a day or two ago with a big reinsurer, Reneging, I think, came out with a statement that on the casualty side, the bar had lifted massively for what they would be willing to take into their portfolio, just because of claims inflation, all the sort of legal practices not being what they would like them to be in the US in terms of the claims that they're worried about in that market. We're at a point where the reinsurers are being very choosy about the business they want to take on. So will reinsurers start to walk away from business that they just don't think is sustainable anymore? And Florida's not looking attractive, I would say, for most people with this recent natural disaster performance. But that said, I mean, obviously there's no such thing as an uninsurable risk. There's always a price, right? There's a price that people are willing to pay.
That's the thing that makes Florida so difficult, especially if these storms are consistent and more frequent, is that whilst you're right that there's always a price for the risk that the reinsurers will take on, Florida's already struggling with that. The reason you have the schemes and the reason you have like citizens and these like government programs and insurers and things is because like it's unaffordable for homeowners. Like I remember when I first started my career, we were looking at homes in Florida to insure, and it was like $10,000 a year for just hurricane coverage for premium in addition. And you're like, that's huge amount of money for insurance premium. Most people, listening from the States will have insurance premiums for a grand or two, right, for their homes. So like just for hurricane, and then a lot of times it was, and that 10,000 would come with like a percentage deductible. I'm not sure if this might be out of date information, so please don't shout at your headphones. But it was like you'd also have to pay like a 5 or 10% deductible. So if your home is $1 million, you're paying like $100,000 deductible on, and paying $10,000 a year for the privilege of paying. Like, so it's those kinds of numbers versus a 1,000, 2,000 pound, 2,500 pound deductible or dollar deductible. So it's already a market that struggles to make it affordable for like regular people. And these types of events, and if insurers go out of business, it further constrains who's able to operate there. Like the knock-on effect is sizable.
Maybe Florida turns into just a giant non-hurricane season. Disney World. Disney can buy the whole state and just only available outside of the months.
It'd be
September through November.
Is it still the happiest place in the world then at that point?
Or June?
Hard to say.
This is the interesting thing. So I've just made an interesting comment about Disney World, because apparently Disney's one of the best places to ride out a hurricane, because they're the second place to get the lights back on after the hospitals is the current gossip about Disney. But I used the months June to November. It's a really long season, and we're only in early October. So the fact that the sea's still hot, we're at the letter M so far. What if this isn't the end? What if there's still more hurricanes to come this year? That's something we've got to bear in mind as a possibility as well, as we get towards the end of the season.
Let's stay in the complications of how, because we went from like kind of the hours clause / event cover things. You have the definite threat of the debris or the shrapnel, which could be from leftover from Helene, that can be thrown around from Milton, which is super, super dangerous. There's also the complexity of the claims handling process. Florida already takes a lot of heat from like the way that they sort of track claims and claims adjustment in that state. So that's going to be, with both of these storms and the sort of footprint of them, like they're going to be the demand for claims adjusters is going to be far in excess of the supply in an environment so that will be a mess to unpack as the adjusters try to come through there. And so that's a concern that people are already pointing out, this second major loss in the area to drive up the loss adjustment expenses, which also trickle through to reinsurance.
Right? Yeah, completely. Yeah.
If we pause there, because I want to come back and talk about like the state mechanisms and the threat this poses to the FHCF and similar. But if we pause there, and say it's let's assume worst case scenario, it's in excess of $75 billion, which begins to really beat up retro as well. Given that it's the sort of 9th of October right now, do you think the retro books getting sort of battered or perceived to be battered, the claims sort of they're aware of them, is that going to have immediate impact on this 1/1? Because a couple of years ago we had the 1/1 was burdened by like a very late retro hardening that caused the whole market to scramble for capacity. We didn't have that last year, but 2 years ago we did. Do we see a similar risk here?
So the retro market's not that big, which is quite interesting. Like relative to all reinsurance, retro is a bit more vulnerable to rapid hardening and softening, because if a few big players pull out, suddenly there's not much retro to support the reinsurers, or if a couple of new players weigh in, suddenly there's loads of retro. It's much more easily impacted. Whereas reinsurance as a whole, it takes a massive whale to make any movement in the sort of pricing environment. I think part of the reinsurance experience was that everybody waited for that class of 22 to emerge. And even if they had emerged, they wouldn't really have made much difference to the amount of capacity available. So the reinsurance pool has stayed fairly static to date. It'll be interesting to see if any withdrawals happen, geography-based or otherwise, that could make a difference. But like even if a massive reinsurer left the market, it's still quite a lot
Yeah.
To go around. But retro, on the other hand, if somebody pulls out of retro for either this renewal or the renewal after, I don't know if it's even mechanically possible for many people to pull out this far into a renewal, let alone culturally or reputationally possible, given where deals might already be at. We could find ourselves with a big hole in retro if people decide they don't want to play anymore.
Yeah.
Come next year.
Yeah, because it's most of the hurricane exposed business will have been done by now, right? There's still some 1/1s trickling through, but the bulk of that's like 1/7.
Yeah, this is true. This is true.
So,
a lot of Florida,
so
it's going to be, we're just watching it.
Yeah.
So it's more, will that capacity that's been earmarked, I guess, still be there by the time we get to those renewals?
Yeah, will people be looking at the exposure that their book has or their capital has to these losses, and does that create a perception of concern for how much they want to deploy to 1/1 business? But it might not be this specific, but these deals are mostly done.
Yeah.
Which is also why the hurricane renewal season is when it is. It's like you want to get that done like in advance of these things, so you're not in it. I remember when I was first doing the Japan business, like we were coming up to renewals like as you had earthquakes, and that like we just did extensions. We sort of took all the contracts and sort of drugged them out 3 more months and said we'll reassess these deals, but we cannot do it right now. Right. Like you might have some of that happening in Florida if their book was, they waited to do it at 1/1. But I think there's a reason why people do most of it at 1/7.
Yeah, but even then, I think we will see, it's the interconnected economy of the reinsurance industry and the world, right? So in the same way that, conflict in the Middle East can drive up oil prices in all other parts of the world. Reinsurance, events in Florida can mean that the insurance costs in Asia can suddenly increase because of the global pools of capacity being affected. So even if, it's not specifically Florida that we're talking about, the people who had planned on reinsuring you wherever you are in the world, this 1/1 are going to be now counting slightly fewer chickens in their head. And they're going to be, okay, well, I've got all these other claims I need to pay out. I had, planned on having this much money available for claims for your book, but actually I need slightly more because I know that I'm going to have that much less now, etc.
Well, and this is where like sort of this I think this conversation is going to feel scattered a bit because there's so many like threads that we can pull on, but this is where the track matters so much, not just in terms of the cost that it will have, but like if it hits more of the Tampa area, which is more residential, the attachment points for those books are lower and the insured costs are higher and the vulnerability is higher. But if it moves further south, you hit the more commercial books, which attach differently and are a bit more stable. So you don't have the spread of losses the way you do in the residential area. But if it goes further south, the commercial book, the commercial property industry, if you will, is starting to soften. And like that will obviously very quickly put a stop to any softening you have there, where the residential homeowners books are still quite hard. This will just make that fun. So there's a lot of like connected, like adjacent portfolios that like are different things, but based on the track it takes, could have a quite sizable impact on either of those two portfolio types.
Yeah, it feels oddly like every hurricane track is a black swan event, doesn't it? Sometimes it's like you don't believe that this particular event is likely to happen until you see one, but you've only seen a quite finite number of massive Cat 5 hurricanes hit the US, or I know this is now a Cat 4, but people talk about, it could do this particular route because we did see one do that particular route in 1920, for example. That's the sample size we're working on. That said, I think modelling is maybe worth talking about a little bit here because it has quite manifest impacts in multiple directions, which you kind of have to see how they cancel each other out. On one hand, we are able to model much better as an insurance and reinsurance industry to charge appropriately for the risk that's expected. We're also able to account for example, many, many different changes according to climate change in theory that could reduce in intensities. I don't know whether we would have accounted in any of our models for the possibility that there's a ton of debris flying around that's, has to be included in the forecast now. It's not just water and wind, it's also water and wind and lumps of the buildings and things that got broken up previously.
Well, and if you think about the compounding impact of a couple storms, like if you take like storm surge and flooding, yes, there's just natural recession, but there's mechanisms by which you can drain cities, right? But if those are all backed up because of debris from other places, you're sort of starting with clogged pipes, or it's like
weakened structures,
and you have it where it's not fully receded all the other sort of water damage that's been there, and you go again.
It's a different modeled scenario.
It's a fundamentally different modeled scenario.
I think what's also interesting though is it's perhaps life reinsurance more than reinsurance, but also to some extent asset protection. You have a scenario where model availability in the last decade or two has improved massively for the general public. So people are much more aware and have been much more aware that this storm is coming and where it's coming, quite a long way in advance. Not much faster than is possible. It's not been a question if you had weeks in advance, because we don't know, but people have been able to take actions, right? They've been able to evacuate. We've been able to get supplies distributed to some key places. We've been able to set up shelters, or indeed to reuse some that were used for Helene. Just a matter of weeks or days ago. So that could have some mitigating effect on some of the losses. The fact that people have boarded up windows, for example. People have seen how bad Helene was and have been told this one's going to be worse. And so if they didn't board up their windows the first time, they're going to board it up this time. Similarly, I think as you look at how will those people respond to the crisis and how they pretend that their assets, we find actually this event has been quite interesting for the industry as well, because some of the areas affected in Florida are the places where lots of reinsurance buyers live and work, and insurance companies are. So we actually had Tom and Jayton and Ryan out in PCI, the APCIA conference, earlier this week. We were on the phone with them getting like the latest updates to see how people were talking about this at the conference, and actually a lot of people flew home early. They were like, I've got to get home and board up my windows, and so they all took the last flights so they could get back into their parts of Florida that were potentially affected to get their homes ready to prepare for what could happen, and then to get out again to somewhere safe. So people have prepared, hopefully, when they can. Maybe that will have an impact on the resulting loss cost.
It's super scary to think about going into an event, like being away, having to sort of swoop back in, try to do some of the structural admin, if you will, and then immediately try to get out, knowing
fire your gun at the storm a few times.
Knowing how like traffic jams are working and these kind of things. But like one of the more haunting things that I'd read was the mayor of Tampa being like, if you're in an evacuation zone and you don't evacuate, like you will die. Like not mincing words. You're like, they are not joking around. They think this is going to be a very, very dangerous event.
I think some of the numbers we didn't talk about yet was storm surge heights, right? We're talking like 10 to 15 feet. We're talking about a very sort of broad and shallow bay that could be, involved here. That, Florida's not an especially sort of mountainous terrain, right? This storm surge creates a temporary inland sea, effectively, right? And lots of localized flooding. They think probably less rain than Helene. But in terms of that initial storm surge, it's going to be substantial.
That storm surge, by comparison, is almost double what Helene was. So if you experienced or saw photos or evidence of what the aftermath of Helene was, double it is what that number looks like. So when you're looking at photos and things, like use that as a reference point. Like that is, it's very, very big. Then we touched on a little bit, but I think it warrants a bit more discussion around like the Florida Hurricane Cat Fund, like the government program designed to support the state and the insurers in the state around hurricanes specifically. I'll just read some stuff here that's come from the Insurance Insider. So I want to make sure people are getting credit for the really high quality like reporting that they're doing. The scheme offers $17 billion of limit to local insurers. It only has $10 billion in funding on hand at the moment, with another $7 billion in projected cash from pre-event bonds.
Yeah.
Its funding would exhaust at industry losses of about 29 billion. So
wow.
The attachment at 9.9 and co-participation 2.3.
Essentially, you've got people from BMS, I think I read earlier, saying that this is probably at least 20 billion.
Yeah.
In any kind of landfall scenario.
Yeah.
So this seems quite possible.
Yeah, exactly. So like if it's exhausted at 29 and it gets in excess of 75 or so, like you're gonna have a $50 billion hole gap to fill. Like, and yes, you're gonna have the reinsurers coming in supporting some of those things, but like that blows that program up. Yeah. And I don't know enough about it. We've talked about bringing someone from the FHCF onto the podcast. We should probably do following this. But like, what does that mean for the future of that thing? It's there for this safety net, but it shows just an immense inadequacy of it for events like this. But also, like, how do you begin to rebuild that up? Like, it's not the injection of cash every year that puts it at, this level. It sort of accumulates over years to sort of support the really big one-offs. So,
yeah, and like you say, I mean, we had a special episode that we were able to do during the Bermuda Risk Summit back in March. So in the Bermuda series, we spoke with the Florida Insurance Commissioner, who was able to give us like a lot of guidance as to why it was a special state, why things worked and had to work a bit differently there, but also how the case could be made for, why it was a really important state to be involved with as a member of the reinsurance community. I think they're going to have a really interesting kind of message to follow this, right? Like, why is this still the place that's this magical partnership of public and private that can still bring the people who live here and work here the coverage they need? Because it's going to take some convincing for some people, I imagine.
Well, I completely agree. Like and they're also, if given the sizing event where it hits, like there's a real threat to bankrupting insurers in this region now. Like that pitch that that we got, it's like he's going to be making that to like insurance companies, like why you should come back to Florida, why you can do it enough to make money there, knowing that these kinds of things can happen. The pitch is not going to be easy for a couple of years, right? And if you have a benign year next year and the year following, maybe you can begin to sort of evidence that though these are in fact one-offs. But like it certainly feels right now in the frequency of this storm season and the severity of this storm season that people are kind of a bit shell-shocked and a bit like nervous to be like, why would we be here? Like this is so that will be a really interesting thing to watch.
One of the things I'm also watching, I guess, from an industry capital point of view more generally, is the impact this has on the alternative space. I think following the hardening of the market, the sort of turnaround we saw where reinsurers drew a line in the sand and said, sorry, we need more rate if this is going to be a sustainable relationship. We can't be doing the attrition, etc. That pricier, more limited capacity drove some quite meaningful growth in the catastrophe bond segment, the alternative capital segment in general. That I think we've debated a few times on this show. Was that a trend that was going to continue? Was it just something that was temporary because it was cheaper in many ways to go alternative than to go traditional at the time? Would that stick around if the market softened again? We had all those questions. I think what's going to be really interesting is to see whether the capital sticks around if it's burnt badly from this event. We're seeing likelihood of some impact to some of those instruments. I don't know them individually well enough to comment on any particular ones, but almost certainly some investors are going to experience what happens when there's a hurricane. How we manage that as an industry, whether we can deal with the predictability of those instruments, probably will make quite a big difference. Do they behave as expected? If it's a case that, we knew what we were getting into, the wind blew and so we lost some money, fine. If it's, we couldn't take our money out because there were years of uncertainty around what the final claim cost was going to be, that may be less fine. I know that there are other structures that help out with that have been brought in recently.
Well, we saw ILS grow, and then last year it was amongst the highest offering for alternative assets. But this is going to cause a dent in that. So like the question is, as you say, is like, will they come back? Will they reinvest profits? Will they sort of double down in this space? Will they say, ooh, a couple good years, but that is, you know, and as you say, like, that's if we look at it from a now perspective. If the capital gets trapped because we're still waiting for claims costs to trickle in for years, like that could fundamentally change the appetite that investors have in this space, at least net new investors.
Like the Harvey or the Irma Maria years.
Yeah.
Climate change, what role do you think it plays in this? Are we seeing a recognition that we're in a different world at the moment, or is it sort of acknowledged as people take decisions now?
I think there seems to be a collective agreement that the warming ocean is making this worse.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, will people feel like there's very little we can do? Like, we say if we take corrective action now, the ocean won't be fundamentally cooler next hurricane season. Like, is it almost, are we getting to a point where people feel like, oh, it's too late kind of thing?
I think you're right to highlight there's a real risk of sort of we missed the boat apathy kind of. Well, it is what it is now. I asked you, but it's interesting also reading some of the climatologists' viewpoints here around this sort of butterfly effect, almost, of like a tiny like degree change in sea temperature has potentially massive effects in terms of natural disasters, whether that's wildfire, whether that's flood, whether that's windstorms and so on. They can massively grow to devastating effect from like a very, very small movement in temperature. So I think there's probably a case that the scientists will be making to the people who are like, oh, too late. That no, actually, if we can avoid any more, it's going to make a really, really big difference still.
This is just getting started. Like, what about 4 or 5 Cat 5s in a single season if we don't address this
permanent hurricane? No, exactly. That would be.
Or the other thing that you see with
Sharknadoes
is I think one of the bigger concerns is if we continue to see warming, like a lengthening of the hurricane season. You mentioned your June to November dates, but if we've talked about that sort of like on like crops, like on like a latitude basis, but if you have it where that warming means the hurricane season actually just extends into middle of December or starts in April, like what if half the year has the conditions where the ends are like the middle now, and then the middle is even more extreme? Like, that would be a disaster. So it's certainly something that I think our industry is quite cognizant of. It's more of like, will the masses, will the populace go, okay, this is a thing we need to start spending more energy on to fix. But hey, stuff. Let me just read through some of the other things that we've got like on our notes to try to cover off.
This is a usually no notes show, but
this is usually
quite a big topic.
We
want to be as up to date as we can with the latest.
We talked a bit about retro and we think is going to happen at 1/1. That is an interesting one. I think I'm very much looking forward to the conversations at Baden-Baden, to the conversations at Cirque in Singapore, albeit it's in Asia. You'll still there'll be a tone of this being a worldwide event for our industry, because I think we'll have a lot of interesting feedback as to what we think the market is going to be doing. So stay tuned for both the write-ups that we do following those events as well as the podcast we do following those events, because there will be a lot of interesting things happening there.
I think the timing is interesting, right? So I feel like Ian, if I remember correctly, the time that it came was slightly earlier in the calendar, but
see if I have the date.
We might have at this point, reinsurers who've already quoted on stuff. In which case, probably with an indicative order as well, like how much they'd be likely to authorize. So do you think we have a risk of people reneging on those sort of commitments and saying, oh, actually, no, the dynamics changed or the context has changed, so we want to see firm order terms reissued? Like I can imagine that some people came in a few weeks ago targeting firm order terms with rate decreases, right? In quite a few segments, probably quite a few people were coming into this renewal being like, we've had it's a couple of hard years, and they've been good years, and the reinsurers are making loads of money, so we should be pushing for a rate decrease. And reinsurers probably quite reasonably have said, well, fair enough, you're a good client, we trust you, we want to keep this partnership, we want a big share, so we'll accept a small decrease. We're holding on to terms where they were. We're still not letting you have that ag cover or that layer back or whatever. But what happens now? Do they say, okay, we said we'd do that rate, so we'll do it, but next year is going to be an uplift, which is maybe the more chivalrous response? Or do they turn around and say, sorry, that was before, this industry-changing, potentially $100 billion event waltzed in and ruined Florida?
I'm super interested to see what happens.
And that's going to be deal by deal, right? There might be some broad statements made from, I'd be surprised if there weren't, internally. CEOs coming to their reinsurance teams and saying, this is our policy.
Well, the reason
go enforce it.
The reason this specific question is so interesting to me is because when the market had the abrupt hardening in 22, one of the things we'd heard over and over and over was like cedents who were like furious, like
the way it was handled, right?
Well-known reinsurers on how it was handled, and be like, we will never work with this certain company again, and it names that we were shocked to hear at times. Knowing how that went down, knowing how the feedback went, knowing how those relationships are still like possibly, if they're trying to be salvaged, are being worked on. The response in relation to this will be, like, if people started pulling from other terms, like now in early October, that could be just permanently destructive to some of those relationships. Perhaps not. Perhaps they can be sold on the fact that this is a market shifting event and we deserve to have a chance to re-rate this based on what we now know. But I don't know, and that's. But we talked about this being a relationship-driven industry before. The reason it's so interesting to me is because we saw really prominently the threat of damaging relationships a couple of years ago. Will the reinsurers take it again and say the shareholders matter more? Or will they take it as we need to make profitability, and that's what's better for the shareholders? We're pulling out and take it or leave it to the cedents. I don't know, and that's gonna be so.
The good news is
fascinating to watch.
The good news is that our listeners will be able to follow everything with our Baden edition of the Reinsurance Podcast. We will be live.
This will probably feature prominently. The updates.
We'll be getting tons of perspectives from all sorts of people around the industry on what this means for them, how they're responding. I think we're doing it from the Loffenbräu. Which I think is how you say Lowenbräu, or that beer that people drink that's German that we all say wrong.
I'm just there to drink it, not there to pronounce it. But if you're listening and you have people at your company or on your team and you want to join that conversation in Baden-Baden, drop us a message, producer at thereinsurancepodcast.com, because it is going to be a super, and we want to hear the industry's thoughts around this, amongst other topics as well. But please do reach out to us if you want to take part in that. The industry, like, we are the voice of the people now at this point, so please do make your voice heard.
And speaking of the people, if you are the people who are in Florida or have people affected in Florida, do stay safe as you can. And let's hope it's less of an event than we're anticipating.
We're all sitting here, fingers crossed, that it's going to sort of take a turn and dissipate to a Cat 3 and cause far less damage than hoped. But this episode, we felt warranted, let's talk about it now to the listeners of this podcast who are very much interested in this developing topic. So stay safe, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
See you on the other side, folks. Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn and visit our website at supercede.com/podcasts. You'll find the links in the show notes.